us. I'd like to first start off with getting your thoughts on the progress Nigeria has made in democracy. Let me start with Toyin first.
Well, thank you for having me here on CNBC Africa. The first thing I will say is that it is a good thing that we continue to have a relatively peaceful transition from one period of governance to another. And so to that extent, we're happy that we're through with the elections and we're having the inauguration tomorrow. I think we can, to a great extent, now describe Nigeria as a stable democracy. We have successfully transited from one political party to another. We have successfully transited over time from one administration to another, and we have demonstrated that we can conduct elections successfully. So on the whole, we've made progress over time. Obviously, the electoral process itself still has challenges in terms of perception as to whether or not it is completely free and fair, and in also terms of the power of incumbency that still seems to be very strong. But if you look at what happened in some of the states, for example, we have seen that even this power of incumbency, so to speak, can actually be overturned. So I think we've made some fair progress. And there's always room. The greatest room is always the room for improvement.
All right, Toyin says fair progress. Taiwo?
I would agree with Toyin, actually. And I think I would also like to emphasize the strength of some of our institutions. They're not there, but they're getting better. And in particular, it will be INEC. The fact that largely you would give it to them that they did all they could to make sure that, whoever won was based on the votes of the people. There used to be a time in Nigeria that we thought that votes were written even before the elections. And the second one would be the judiciary. Again, they're not there yet, but with the judgment we're seeing now, it's nothing to do with whether it's the party in power. So they tend to do what they do independently. So it's a journey that we have started. Hopefully we don't take steps backwards more than the ones we take forward.
All right, so I'm hearing fair progress here. I'm also hearing strength of institutions. Judge?
Yes, I share the views of my fellow panelists. There is progress has been made since 1999. And if democracy is generally described as the peaceful transition of power from one polity to another, then we've done generally well. This is not to say there haven't been pockets of disturbances, but they've not shaken what I would call the foundation. So what we really need to do is to then strengthen the institutions that protect your democracy. And I share Taiwo's views that INEC should improve on its game. We must get to that point where we should have somewhat seamless elections. India just completed an election where over 600 million people voted, and the results were out over the weekend, no rancor, nothing. And that's because the process is in place. We're transparent enough for people to accept the results. People will always win, people will lose, but the process is important. So that, I think, should be the next phase of our fight. The judiciary, the arbiter, is also very important. They're under a little bit of stress at this point, but they must be their own savior, because if they stand up for what is just and what is right, they will straighten the politicians. Politicians will always want to stretch the rules, but if they know that if they cross the line, they will be guillotined, they will begin to play by the rules. And once that happens, I think we can say we've arrived.
All right, interesting you bring that up, because I'd like to also take you up on the fact that, over the past 4 years, when you look at how the three arms of government have worked together, we've seen skirmishes here and there.
Sure.
I would like to get your thoughts on how best to make the three arms understand, the importance of each arm and how best they can work together to get with all of them playing on their strengths.
The starting point is always the law. The ground norm is a constitution, and it clearly states that these arms are expected to operate independent of each other. So first of all, I think the starting point would be to respect each other's space. When you try to overreach, as politicians will always want to do, it could be a problem. So at times, a lot of self-restraint is called for. the reason you shouldn't just wake up nilly-nilly and delve into somebody's space is because the Constitution expects that you respect the order that has been created. That's what makes for order. The moment you begin to cross boundaries, then you are inviting anarchy. And once anarchy sets in, it defeats the whole essence of having a democracy. We must guard this democracy jealously. It's everybody's business to protect, because, as I'm sure we'll discuss later on, it is also the basis upon which you can attract investments into the country. Once you are perceived to be stable, then investors can say, okay, this is the region where we can put our money at risk.
All right, now let me come to Toyin now. Toyin, let's look at how this progress we've seen so far, would you say it has translated into gains for the man on the street?
Unfortunately, I will say that the gains for the man on the street are still few and far between. Unfortunately, the man on the street oftentimes has been the victim of election violence, for example, and we have not been able to eradicate or even minimize incidents of violence at our, elections. So that still becomes an area of challenge. Also, the ability for our leaders to divorce politics from economic decision making is also an aspect that ultimately impacts on the value that the man on the street is getting from the democracy. So we need to have the confidence that our leaders will take dispassionate decisions to implement, for example, critical reforms that are required for the long-term prosperity of our nation, which of course impacts on the lives of the people. And where short-term political gains are put before and ahead of the long-term good of the populace, then the man on the street is getting shortchanged.
All right, Taiwo, I'd like to take it from this angle with you. I'd like to first ask you, when you look at some of the key national issues that were prevailing before this administration came in there, how do you think we have moved the needle on maybe any of them, or do we regress in any one?
Unfortunately, I would say that we have far too many of those indices where we've made negative progress, and then the ones where we have made positive progress. If you think about it and you look at unemployment, for example, we are far worse today than we were 4 years ago. Look at the mystery index, which is also a combination of unemployment and inflation. It's worse than it used to be. Look at the deficits that we're running, the debts that we have as a country. All those are pointing in the wrong directions. A few positives, I would say, maybe if you look at the fact that this was induced by the recession in any case, but then we did it. We're now less dependent on importation than we used to be, which means we're trying to provide the things that we need by ourselves. If you also look at the fact that the exchange rate of Naira to the dollar in particular has been stable now for almost 2 years, that's also a plus. We're also trying to do a few things where we have made some gains around agriculture and also the interventions for small businesses, even though the scale hasn't been at the level where you begin to move the needle. So I'll say there have been some efforts. It's just that it's not enough in terms of what is needed.
Judge, your views?
Let me start first. I worry about how expensive our democracy is. And I think at times it underpins the outcome of many of these elections. Even though by law you are not supposed to donate more than a certain sum towards electioneering expenses, we find today that we're talking for small offices like local government chairman, House of Rep and all that. People are talking in hundreds of millions of naira. And in some cases, when they don't have the money, they're actually sponsored by those. And what that then portends is that this democracy could be hijacked by those who have the money. And coming hot on the heels of that is the way the youth are employed during electioneering period. Suddenly, there's employment for everybody, but it's in the negative sense. people are carrying guns, they're basically doing their master's bidding. Then elections are over and they're left out in the cold. The guns are still with them, the ammunition is there, and then they turn on the citizenry. And the next year or so, you begin to sort of unwind all you've done from the elections, and just as you're settling down, you're getting ready for the next cycle. So we get this vicious cycle of violence during elections, and that really defeats the whole what democracy stands for. And so the dividends we would rightly have reaped from a stable democracy is eluding us somewhat. And it's, like I said, it comes in the form of investments. Every country depends on one kind of foreign investment or the other to grow its economy. But in our own case, the cycle is too short for investors to say, okay, this is a stable polity, let's come into it. And that's the thing I think we all need to collectively tackle.
All right, then we'll keep our eyes on that and look at how things go. But when we return, we'll continue our conversation looking at what to expect from the next cabinet. I've been speaking to Toyin Sanni. She's the Group CEO of Emerging Africa Capital. I also have Taiwo Oyedele, the partner and West Africa tax leader at PwC Nigeria, and George Etomi is the principal partner at George Etomi and Partners. So now let's get into the heat of the moment now. Let's look at the next cabinet. So, you know, we've seen this current cabinet. We understand that there was a long wait before they came into power, and then they got in, and then, you know, people say they didn't hit the ground running. Some will say some did well and all that. But I'd like to get your assessment of the cabinet and what to expect from the next cabinet coming in.
Okay, so first is to say that in assessing the outgoing cabinet is to remember how long it took for them to be on ground and to express a hope that that would not happen this time around. Now, in terms of those who have done well, I think we have made progress in agriculture, and that is reflected in GDP growth, specifically in that sector. I think also that we have made progress in trade and investments from the perspective of the ease of doing business initiative. I think we've moved the needle there, and we need to continue. You know, that pace of progress needs to be sustained. Just the fact that we put in place the ERGP, which has been, that's the Economic Recovery and Growth Plan, which has been commended, is also a plus. Now, the taste of the pudding will be in the eating, and I would like to believe that with politics out of the way for the president, that we'll now see real implementation of that plan in the next 4 years. Those are, you know, pockets of progress. And in terms of my expectations for the new cabinet, the first expectation will be a cabinet that will be comprised of technocrats and will have also a high content of technocrats. I know that we still have to accommodate the politicians, but I would like to see square holes in square pegs. I would also be looking forward to a diversified cabinet. So equal, very strong representation from the women and also from younger persons, the youths. And I would like to say that the women are interested in, you know, some hardcore portfolios, not patronizing assignments, you know, just because we're women. So I'll stop for
all right, very interesting views there, because I actually second that as well. But Taiwo, let me get your thoughts.
Yeah, I do agree as well. I think my assessment of the cabinet, or maybe the last 3.5 years, because they didn't start on time, would be that, you know, we have a good number of people there that are individually brilliant, and I think they did their best in the circumstances. Ministry of Trade and Industry and some of the reforms that the NIPC has been trying to do around attracting investment has been commendable. Also, I'd like to commend also the ease of doing business led by the Vice President and the effort itself, even apart from the outcome that we've been able to record. I think for me, largely, my concern, which is still a concern for me, is the fact that I do not feel like the ministers, in particular, were empowered enough by Mr. President to be able to drive some of their mandates. And if you bring, you know, say, put your best foot forward, but you don't use it to work, it's as good as not putting it forward. and also to have that cohesion in terms of what is it that we are driving as a government, such that if Ministry of Finance is speaking, and Budget is speaking, Trade and Investment is speaking, you see that consistency, which is driven centrally. I'd like to see more of that in the new cabinet. I think we just need to make sure that the way we go about trying to deal with the issues that we face as a nation is at a crisis point. There has to be that sense of urgency. This idea of measuring incremental progress, you know, we did better than previous administration. It used to be 10, now it is 12. Will not get us anywhere. Some of these things are we need transformational changes. Maybe we need to also pick up ERGP and review it. Beyond that, actually implement it in a way that's impactful, inclusive, and people can feel the impact generally.
All right, George?
Well, concerning the cabinet, one thing I know for certain is that once appointed, the president actually gave them a free hand. And many of the ministers that I know personally will tell you that he never generally interfered with how they did their job. It was actually left for them to come up with solutions to whatever they were having to deal with at the time. But what might be more of concern would be the ministers work in conjunction with other agencies of government. And perhaps that's where cohesion was lacking in many of them. Because as you grow an economy, regulations also take center stage. Ministers are dictating policy, but how are the regulators working with the ministry? And if you sort of take it sector by sector, at times you have this mismatch, and it was sending mixed signals. You see, in the end, the result of cohesion shows in investments. And the simple question is that, have we noticed a marked improvement in our investment portfolio as we ought to have? And I think the jury is still out on that. We're still struggling generally with infrastructure. The government has borrowed a lot of money, in some cases very expensive money. Could it have been done differently? When we come down to pricing of so many of these, take electricity for example, which is one of the biggest difficulties. How do you deal with a situation in which the sector is privatized, but they're hamstrung with regard to pricing of the product? And then that leaves investors weary about whether or not they can come forward. And yet everybody will tell you that because it holds the key to the diversification of the economy, you should just sort of let it go. Let market forces begin to determine things. You see, what freedom for investors means is that it actually attracts competition. And competition always takes care of the price issue. So at times, you have this mismatch. And but I share the views of my panelists that the Economic Recovery and Growth Plan has been a very decisive step forward. It's like the Bible of where we are going to. And if many people, even the new cabinet, subscribe to it, will keep tinkering with it, that's what documents are meant for, I think we'll chart a positive way forward.
All right, so more like a continuous review of the Economic Recovery and Growth Plan going forward. Okay, thank you so much for joining me on the show. Very interesting conversations and input you guys have put on the show today. I've been speaking to Toyin Sanni. She's the Group CEO of Emerging Africa Capital. I also have Taiwo Oyedele, is the partner and West Africa tax leader at PwC Nigeria. And George Etomi is the principal partner for George Etomi and Partners.